Here is my Bitcoin 2021 price prediction. In this video, I am going to explain to you where I predict Bitcoin to be in the end of 2021. And I'll try to make this video a little bit different. And instead of giving my opinion, I'll try to base it all based off of data and facts and history. So that way you're not just listening to somebody's BS opinion, because everybody's got their own opinion. So with that being said, also, I want to set the frame on what's happening in the global economic system first, and then we'll dive into kind of more the charts and the data. But you got to have to understand both of these components at play here in order to properly predict Bitcoin. Now, at the end of the video, I'm going to give you my exact price, but I'm going to lead it up a little bit because I want you to understand and get an idea. So this isn't just a video of, oh, he thinks it's going to be 50,000, he thinks it's going to be 100,000, but I actually want you to be able to learn how to think and how to analyze properly for yourself. So with that being said, let's go ahead and let's dive into what's actually happening in the global economic spectrum. As we know, the COVID pandemic hit, and that put pretty much the entire world economy in the trash can. And what's happened around the world is central banks have had to go to massive amount of money printing in order to somewhat stimulate the economy. And if you look at what's happening with the dollar, I mean, you can see that 35% of all dollars were printed in just the last 12 months. And to take a look at 2018, when we had a giant recession, back here, I mean, it's like a blip on the chart compared to what's actually happening right now. I mean, it's just insane with the way that the governments are having to print money. And the real narrative behind Bitcoin is it's a massive inflation hedge. So people are running to things like Bitcoin because of the excessive money printing that's going on. And really what's happening with the dollar is continuing to lose its purchasing power. The dollar is being debased. And this is not just happening in America, but it's happening all around the world. So people that hold their money in cash are becoming poorer and poorer. And unfortunately, this is the bottom 50%, or the kind of like the bottom 50%. They generally hold their money in cash, not in investments. So they're getting poorer. And this is kind of a sad thing that's happening right now. Now, most people would come to things like the S&P index fund, which, you know, obviously tracks the 500 most successful companies in America. And they say, wow, we've had such an amazing year, of growth. You know, the S&P index is way, way up. But when you really look at it on this chart here to the right, you can see it compared to the Fed balance sheet, which is basically how is the asset performed in comparison to basically the real value of money, or the debasement of money. And you can see that in reality, you've actually lost wealth if you've stored your money in the S&P index fund. And this is happening all over the place. Most people think of gold as this ultimate store of value. And you can see the same thing happening here, where yes, it's continued to rise in price because the denominator is the US dollar. But really what's happening, this US dollar is dying, it's devaluing. And so if you held your money in gold in comparison to like real wealth or the Fed balance sheet, then you could see that you've also lost wealth holding your money in gold. The same thing happening with the Case-Shiller index, which is basically, you know, having your money in your home. This is average home prices in America. And you can see that, of course, average home prices has skyrocketed. Why have they skyrocketed in this past year? Well, because they're being compared to the US dollar. When you look at it compared to the Fed balance sheet, you can see that you've really lost money here. So the only asset that has really outperformed the Fed balance sheet has actually been Bitcoin. You can see the price of Bitcoin here, and you can see the Fed balance sheet, the Bitcoin compared to the Fed balance sheet right here. So what does this all really mean? Well, what this really means is that the government has to continue to print money. And this is the slippery slope that happens with fiat money in history all over the time. Fiat money just doesn't work. If you take a look at the most successful fiat currency, which is the Great British Pound, it's been around for 314 years. However, been around for 314 years, but it's lost 99.6% of its purchasing power. So the problem here with money printing is it's kind of like doing heroin. Not that I know what it's like to do heroin. I've never done it, but or crack. But you do it one time and you get this high, right? That's like money printing. You do it one time, you get this high, and then you got to do it again. And you got to do it again. But each time you do it, you got to do more and more and more. And that's what we're seeing that's happening. So with that being said, that's what's really happening. Now, what is happening with Bitcoin? Well, what's really happening with Bitcoin, if you take a look at it, people are comparing it to the gold market as like a store of value. People are running because they know that if they hold their money in cash, they know that their wealth is being rotted away. If we look at gold, which has been historically the store of value, Bitcoin is digital gold. It's better store of value than gold because it actually is truly scarce. They're mining, new gold. They don't know how much gold is actually in the earth. Bitcoin is a finite thing. It's only $21 million and it's way more transportable. I mean, imagine trying to carry $1 billion worth of gold. You can't do that. You need semi trucks, and you need freaking maybe even bigger than that to try and transport gold around. Whereas you could hold trillions of dollars worth of Bitcoin simply in your head with your passphrase. So they've likened it to the market cap of gold. So let's say that, market cap of gold is like 11.5. Let's just call it $10 trillion, for example. And let's just say, for example, if we take a look at, the price of Bitcoin right now of making this video is around like $33,000. And if we look at the total market cap being around like $1.4 trillion currently at the time of making this video, I think we all understand that, yes, Bitcoin is going to reach the level of store value or the market cap of gold. For sure, the entire cryptocurrency space is going to grow to at least 10 trillion. That means like we have nearly like a 10x from this point, so just put that into, round, numbers. That'd be putting, Bitcoin at around like $330,000. Now, obviously, I don't expect that to happen this year, but just to put it into perspective, if all cryptocurrency space, all it did was a store of value, we'd expect it to have a $10 trillion market cap, which, as we know, the cryptocurrency space is much broader, much more useful than just what gold is, which you can't really even use anyway. So I'm going to get into the charts here in just a second and actually pinpoint what I think a price could be, but I want to set this up for you. So let's continue to see what's happening. We see that, okay, well, the government is continuing to print money. The fiat money system is, you're being robbed of your wealth. The fiat currencies around the world are becoming worth less and less. And at the same time, what we see is we see massive institutions for the first time ever, basically going in and starting to adopt Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So for example, here we take a look at MicroStrategy. They now own over 100,000 Bitcoins, more than $3 billion. This is, a massive publicly traded company, led by Michael Saylor. We also see some of the most brilliant investors of all time, like Paul Tudor Jones, who go all in on inflation trades, which he basically said that he'd want 5% Bitcoin allocation. He's one of the most brilliant investors of all time. So we see this institutional adoption that is just continuing to play out right in front of our face. But we see it also at the banking level, with the central banking level, with El Salvador that's just made Bitcoin legal tender in their country. We also see other countries like Argentina and Mexico and Paraguay and a whole bunch of other countries that are talking about making Bitcoin legal tender. Mexico supposedly, this just came out today, to propose some sort of Bitcoin law in Mexico, which is just massive if you really think about it. And on top of that, we saw just a few days ago that nearly 4,000 German institutional funds can now allocate up to 20% to crypto. And if you'd like to follow us on Instagram, we're Blue Edge Crypto. We post a lot of interesting insight there. Now, this is kind of the overall sentiment. This is like what's happening, right? These institutions, they realize that they need to go other places besides the dollar, besides the stock market, to get an actual return on their investment, because their, really their investments aren't performing. Now, let's take a look at the technology of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is really a technology, and we have to look at how new technology grows, and then we'll get into the actual charts. Well, if you take a look at anything, you look at businesses, you look at nature, you look at, how humans grow, anything, like they all follow this thing called a sigmoid curve or an S curve, where you basically go through this kind of quiet period of growth and then you hit this growth spurt, right? And you grow a whole bunch, like during puberty. There's also businesses go through this phase where they just start skyrocketing, and then you reach this age of maturation where it kind of evens off. So if we take a look what's happening in any new technology adoption cycle, especially with Bitcoin, we can see that, basically we've had kind of this slow run up and we're starting to gather steam and we're starting to gain momentum, and we're probably somewhere around like here, around this point here, and boom, it'll just continue to exponentially grow, and I'll explain that in a second why, and then we'll hit this plateau stage where it like kind of evens off. And if you think about like social media is an easy one to compare it to. If we saw like social media, when it first started with things like AIM, Instant Messenger, and MySpace, and then we had Facebook, boom, and all these social media companies just took off, and now they're kind of at this plateau stage. At the same time as technology is incorporated, old technology is unincorporated, right? It's just it goes on the same sigmoid curve, right? And I really think that we're kind of like here, like in this phase right here, for some reason, I believe this because this is really the first time that we're seeing like institutions adopt it, today. So maybe we're like kind of like, maybe here or so on this S curve, but we have a long ways to go. And I really think, this video, I'm going to tell you the 2021 Bitcoin prediction, but I really think if you're thinking about 2021 Bitcoin prediction, you're thinking about Bitcoin wrong. Like you need to think of this as like a 5 or 10 year play or as an asset that you never even sell. So I think that's the real way to think about Bitcoin. So you may want to change the way you think about it. But another thing to consider here before we actually get into some of the charts here is to understand how network technologies actually grow. Okay, so there's something called Metcalfe's Law, and it basically says that as more members of the network come into the network becomes stronger. So if you think about like printers fax machines back in the day, if only I had a fax machine and then, it's not that valuable. If I have a fax machine and you have a fax machine, then it becomes infinitely more valuable because now we can send faxes between each other. But if 10 people have a fax machine, now it becomes even more value. The network becomes more valuable and so on and so forth. 100 people, 100,000 people have a fax machine. Now it's really valuable to have a fax machine because I can easily send, documents, really easily. Same thing happened with cell phones. Okay. If just one person has a cell phone, not really useful. But if a billion people have a cell phone, well, it becomes really, really valuable. The network grows exponentially. And that's the same thing that's happening with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is it's a network adoption curve that's happening with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. If we look at cryptocurrencies compared to the internet was the fastest growing technology. Well, now cryptocurrencies are an even faster growing technology as far as adoption speed goes, meaning people actually adopting it and the network actually growing. And if you think about like where we're actually at, you can see this black line is number of internet users, and we see this blue dotted line here is the number of cryptocurrency blockchain wallet users. I mean, it's just it's mirroring what happened with the internet, and especially when, Elon Musk comes out with Starlink and there's Wi-Fi, pretty much everyone has access to Wi-Fi on the planet. You can see this adoption curve is just going to continue to grow, right? So the real way to look at it is to look at Bitcoin compared to Metcalfe's Law, which is this law that states that, as more people come into the network, then it becomes more valuable. So as more people adopt Bitcoin, it becomes more and more valuable. So with that being said, you can see this kind of Metcalfe's Law adoption curve here, and you can see the price of Bitcoin is kind of just like hugging it really perfectly. It's actually quite a beautiful thing to see. So before we go into the actual charts, I just wanted to say this also too, if you're interested in finding viral altcoins before the rest of the internet does, you can go to blueedgecrypto.com/viral. We wrote this free report for you, so that way you can understand how to find viral coins before the internet does, because if you're hearing about it on Facebook and Twitter, the sad reality is that you're too late to the game. So we'll show you how to do that. Now, let's continue to take a look at this, right? So Bitcoin is interesting in the fact that it has something called a halving. If you're unfamiliar with it, every 4 years, right, Bitcoin has this halving where the supply of Bitcoin is cut in half. So when you decrease the supply, what happens? The demand goes up generally, and price will increase whenever supply is cut, right? For example, we saw that, happening with a lot of raw materials this year as well, with the COVID pandemic not being able to provide these raw materials. So supply was cut. So we saw the price of things like lumber really increased quite a lot. So let's take a look at what's actually happened here historically before I give you the Bitcoin price prediction. But and by the way, if this video has been helpful or insightful, then go ahead and like and leave us a comment, and also turn on the post notifications, subscribe, do all that good stuff. That really helps the channel, helps us spread the word of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and helps this mass adoption that's pretty much inevitable at this point. But look at this. Halving number one. This happened back in November of 2012, and you can see that from halving, it was like, price was like around $12, $13 when the halving happened, and it went all the way up to the high during this bull run was at $1,200. So it did like 100x from the previous, from where the halving actually happened, which was pretty awesome. If we look at it from the previous peak, price was about like $30 and it went all the way up to like, $1,100 or so. So pretty impressive. And we see this happening pretty much after every halving because the supply gets cut, right? And everything's just happening in unison. The mass adoption, the institutional adoption, all of this is happening simultaneously. Well, during the second halving, what happened was price during the second halving was about $750, and we saw it go up all the way to like $20,000, which I believe is like a 25x from here to here, which is pretty significant if you ask me. Okay, now if we look at this next halving, it just happened back in May of 2020. We see that the price, prior to the halving was like $10,000 and it went up to $60,000, which is only a 6x, all right? If we take a look from the previous high of 20 grand up to 60 grand or 64 grand, it's only about a 3x, okay? Now, if we look at history tends to repeat itself, it tends to rhyme, right? I think we still have quite a long ways to go if we just take a look at this chart, okay? Now, also a couple other things that are coming into play here is we see that there's a massive supply shock underway as Bitcoin withdrawal rate spikes a one-year high, right? So what's actually happening here? We can see that basically people are moving their Bitcoin off of exchanges and they're bringing them to their cold wallet. So what does this mean? This generally means that when people do this, they expect to hold Bitcoin for the long run. They expect price to actively rise. Now, we also see that new active wallet addresses has pretty much skyrocketed at this point at junction that we're at right now. So I think we could be very close to the bottom of this pullback at the time I'm making this video, which may become irrelevant if we really take a zoom out and look at it from a longer time frame, which I think you should look at this anyways. I don't think you should be so concerned with 2021, but I think you should look at it maybe like what's happening in 2030, right? Now, historically speaking, one of the most accurate models that we've had for any asset that has, been, commodities that have been scarce like gold or silver or platinum has been a stock to flow model. And basically we see, if you're unfamiliar with it, we see that essentially the color basically shows the days until the next halving. So when it gets like down here to purple, that means we're really close to the next halving. Okay. And when it's red, that means we're furthest away from the next halving. So we're kind of like here in the spectrum right here, kind of in this like yellow zone right here. But if you just take a look at this, we see that we've had this pullback here, which, set us back to like $33,000 currently. If you look at what the stock to flow model says at the end of the year, it says that we should be around like $87,000 Bitcoin. I personally think that we could still have a higher Bitcoin towards like $100,000 at the end of the year, going 3x from this point. And you may think that's crazy, but, I'll show you some history to, kind of back that up. And it's really kind of looking like this run is kind of looking more like the 2013 run. If you take a look at it here, we saw that we had this massive pullback here, right? Where it went from like $213 all the way down to $70 before skyrocketing up to $1,000, right? I mean, that's pretty crazy, right? 213 to $74. That's a massive discount, and then pull it all the way up. So could we be seeing the same thing? I don't know, possibly, right? We could see a massive pullback down here, like a 50% correction before we see a massive extension going on up to the upside. So with that being said, let's take a look at the actual charts and to put this into perspective to you. So if you look at this red, candles here, you may be really worried about it. Really what we've seen here is we've seen like a 50% or 55 or so percent pullback here during this phase of the market. Okay. Now, again, I said that I think this is looking a lot more like 2013 as I look at this. And as I study it and I, study the most brilliant people in the space and all that sort of stuff. And I don't claim to be the most brilliant guy, but like I spend majority of my day analyzing and looking at this sort of stuff and reading and listening to some of the smartest people in the world. So I've got a decent idea of what's happening here. So again, if we take a look back in 2013, right? Okay, here's what happened. Price was, again, around like $250 like we previously saw, and it pulled all the way back to like to here, to like $64. That's like a 75% correction that happened here basically at the same time, the same month of the year, right? This was like This was like July down here, right? We saw this, we're July currently right now in this cycle. We saw this massive pullback, and then what happened? Price kind of ranged for a couple months, right? And that's what we're seeing right now. If we take a look what's happened here, we're seeing like, if we look on a smaller time frame, we'll see we had this pullback, and then we've been kind of ranging here in this phase. But what happened? Okay, so let's take a look at what actually happened. Well, if we look at it, price went from like here at $65 all the way up to, $1,100. So this was like a 1,600% increase. And how long did this take to happen? This took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months. Okay. And that's exactly where we're at. If you take it 5 months from July to now, that would put us that's December. That's the end of the year. And that's exactly what happened here with this sort of price action. So, for us to hit $100,000 Bitcoin, we did like over 10x from here to here in 2013. Doing a 10x from this point would put us at like a $300,000 Bitcoin, which I know some people talk about. I don't really think that's possible, but I do think like $100,000 Bitcoin is not out of the question by any means, simply because we've seen it happen. Like at the later stages of these runs, we see price start to go parabolic. I don't really feel like we had that yet this year. So I think there's still that potential that Bitcoin could get up around like $100,000, or, the stock to flow model saying around like $87,000, $88,000. But with that being said, I would also say that, again, if you're looking at it just on 2021, I think you're looking at it too short of a time frame. Like, we really want to look at this thing of like, what's happening over the course of the next 10 years. But this is my prediction. This is obviously all opinion. None of this is financial advice. And this could come back to, haunt me, and I could be completely wrong. I don't know, but this is based on the data that I understand. This is based off of reading some of the most brilliant minds on the planet. This is kind of what I think can happen. And if this was helpful, go ahead and like, subscribe, turn on the post notifications, because we continue to make helpful videos like this to help make your trading and your cryptocurrency journey easy, lucrative, and fun.